Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Jacob L. Wright. Jacob Wright is a biblical scholar and currently serving as Professor of Hebrew Bible at Emory University. Prior to his appointment at Emory, Wright taught at the University of Heidelberg, one of the foremost research-oriented public universities in Europe, for several years. He is the author of many essays, articles, and books. His first book, Rebuilding Identity, the Nehemiah Memoir and its earliest readers, won a 2008 Templeton Prize, the largest prize for first books in religion. Wright published his enhanced ebook, King David and His Reign, Revisited with Apple iTunes in 2013, billed as the first publication of its kind in the humanities. His book, David, King of Israel and Caleb in Biblical Memory, Cambridge University Press 2014, received an honorable mention at the 2015 PROSE Awards, administered by the Association of American Publishers, as well as the coveted the Nancy Lapp Popular Book Award from American Schools of Oriental Research. Today we're talking about his latest book titled Why the Bible Began, an Alternative History of Scripture and Its Origins. The link to purchase this book will be in the History Valley Amazon link, affiliation link in the description below. With that being said, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Wright.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I'd like to start us off with this question. Many scholars, lots of scholars of the Hebrew Bible have written about the origins of the Bible. So what led you to investigate its origins for yourself?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think it goes way back for me. It goes way back when I was a student in college, and I switched my major from pre-med to the humanities and started studying ancient Near Eastern studies, as it's called. It's really the history of the Mesopotamia region and Egypt, and started learning all about these things, started learning the languages. And meanwhile, I was studying Hebrew Bible and was struck with this question: why did we have to wait? I lay that out as I lay out my book. Why did we have to wait all this time to discover these massive archives of great empires, the empires that conquered the two kingdoms that produced the Bible? A text that has gone on in every generation, been transmitted. And so what is it about this text that makes it something that is enduring in a way that other texts are forgotten? And then why is something like that, this remarkable text, why would that have been written in Israel, in Judah? Why particularly there? And why also not just at a large imperial center? You would think like New York or Tokyo or what have you would produce the literature that gets preserved for us for 3 millennia. But when we look at the ancient world, the literature that gets preserved is this from this podunky little place of Jerusalem and Judah, off the beaten path. And so that struck me. And I was doing philosophy as a minor. I was working and going to City College, University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I was very devoted to my studies. And I had mentors who took me under their wing and said, we're going to do this. And then I went off and did a PhD in Germany and spent many years there and got to do Assyriology and biblical studies and have been around really fascinating intellectuals and have brought that to my work on the Bible in a way I think that a lot of biblical scholars don't do. Being someone who's American, has gone to Germany, is Jewish, and has looked at that German past in the face in a very intimate way, in a very extended way, and how that's also shaped my intellectual interest.
And so when you look at the origins of the Bible, and you look at characters like Moses, Joshua, Adam and Eve, Abraham, the Exodus, where are they getting stories like these from? Are they creating them over a long period of time? Are they borrowing some of it from other cultures, some degree of it from other cultures? How did he come up with those stories exactly?
Hmm. Yeah, good. Another good question, because that is a question that all the biblical scholars argue over, and we've never really settled it. And I think I have a good understanding of the broad contours of how this could have happened, how it plausibly could have all evolved. And I share my view with others, but you have to understand that there's a wide spectrum of views on this. So, according to the traditional view, of course, it goes all the way back to Moses or back to these prophets who were writing and shaping text by themselves. And so, the book of Deuteronomy, even though it talks about his own death, Moses must have written it, right? So, critical biblical scholarship pushes back on that point. And one of the ideas that developed um, is that there are multiple sources. And they did this in the book of Genesis, all the way beginning with a French physician named Jean Astruc. And he started seeing the name of God coincide with other uh, narrative streams and started pulling things apart. He did that for the book of Genesis. They couldn't see how it continued in the book of Exodus, but they understood that there are multiple sources in the book of Genesis. Now, what emerged from that was what you know as the documentary hypothesis, the JEPD theory. And that is an attempt to say, well, the sources that we find in Genesis actually continue on into the book of Exodus and beyond. They're the same sources. And what we've, as a German trained scholar, what I'm very convinced about is that there is no connection originally between Genesis and Exodus. Not many people understand that on the conceptual level, on the level of some tradition, but no, also on the textual level, there is no connection, and that they were brought together at a late point. You can see the seams of those two different very conceptions of Israel's origins being brought together and sewn together in Exodus 1. Now, how to answer your question, so if the text has these multiple sources, let me step back and say, well, where do all the stories come from? Are they just created whole cloth? Are they invented? Are they oral tradition and so forth? And what I try to show in the book is how this all works. Some of the stories are like in the book of Genesis, are tied historically to regions and tribes. We think of them as like 12 tribes of Israel, but that's a highly evolved construction. There were tribes, but there were also regions, and sometimes the names are not clear whether they refer to regions or refer to actual people groups. But what they probably didn't refer to at the beginning was to sons, namely sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Jacob that the Bible constructs. And so a lot of these communities may have had some kinds of tradition linked to these representative figures, but in large part, it's the work of biblical authors who are trying to say this region over here and this region over here will actually belong to the descendants of a common ancestor. And that's a political affirmation of unity, that we're one people. We go back to one family. And my whole agenda in the book is like, how do we explain that move by scribes to do that kind of work when it's so distinctive in the ancient Near East? And it's that kind of work that prompted questions about, well, what does it mean to be a family? What does it mean, above all, to be a people? And how do we think about our existence in a new way that's not about just heroes and kings and establishing monarchies? And so to answer your question about like where all these stories come from, we'll have to like take some examples. One of those stories, like the Exodus story, probably comes after the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians in 722. There's these two kingdoms, and we'll have to come back to that perhaps. Two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Southern kingdom is Judah, and the northern kingdom is called Israel. And it's a powerful kingdom. It was the more powerful one, much more. And it was destroyed in 722. or 720, what have you, by the Assyrian Empire. And I think scholars tend to agree that the Exodus story has real origins in this period, in which the defeated communities of the North are trying to say, we are still Israel. We're still Israel without the kingdom. And what made us Israel, or what actually was the most momentous, pivotal point of departure for all else in our history, was this thing called the Exodus, when we were brought out of slavery in Egypt. And the one who did it was not a king, not anything linked to our dynasty, not the palace, not even a male hero, nothing. It was a deity. And so that move there is an attempt to say we can be Israel even when we don't have a kingdom. And we can go piece by piece. I write on the Song of Deborah a lot, which is considered to be this really ancient piece of poetry going all the way back to the Bronze Age. Well, that's unlikely. And for most people, and I try to show it's actually quite better situated directly in this time too, after 722, when Israel's trying to create an identity of various tribes that can be brought together and that we all are one people.
Can you tell us a bit about the two kingdoms of Judah and why
Israel,
it's
yeah.
important to understand them when it comes to biblical
Mhm.
origins?
Yeah, that's a perfectly important question there, because without understanding these two kingdoms, one doesn't understand the answer that I'm offering to why we have a Bible. Okay, so I've done a lot of these interviews, and a lot of people are focusing on the defeat part, and defeat is an important part of my book. But let's face it, all kingdoms were defeated. So why is it just that Judah and Israel produced the Bible if other kingdoms were defeated, especially the empires that were conquered eventually? And that's why it's so important to understand this division, not just defeat, but division between North and South, very much like the US, in the North and the South. The Northern Kingdom of Israel, which I just mentioned, was like this really important, prosperous, influential territorial state with its capital in Samaria, and a smaller kingdom to the south called Judah. And it was reigned from Jerusalem. And that's where the Davidic dynasty had its home. And these two kingdoms existed side by side. But it's important to know that the Judean kingdom in the south was always in the shadow of the northern kingdom. And the Judean kingdom resented that relationship. The northern kingdom had even placed one of their own on the throne and ousted the Davidic dynasty for a while. That was Athaliah. Racine has a play about it, right? That's an important moment, but it also just shows you how much influence the Northern Kingdom had over the South. Now, here's what happened. The Northern Kingdom exerted influence, and it created this larger kind of identity. I trace a lot of that back to the attempt by Ataliah's ancestors, the Omri dynasty, to somehow connect some of the dots of their very diverse kingdom that they created. But it was the downfall of the Northern Kingdom that then set it all in motion with the story like of the Exodus or the Song of Deborah. But here's the key point, that those texts would not have been written if it were not for the Southern Kingdom to have produced their stories of King David. Right? King David, they start talking about our ancestor. The Davidic dynasty was chosen by God, our God, the God of Israel, the Lord, Yutevavhe, or pronounced Yahweh, Jehovah, right? That God chose, who is the God of all Israel, chose our dynasty, our ancestors, the Davidic dynasty, and the city of Jerusalem to be where it's all at. And the reason why we didn't have that for many years and centuries is because the Northern Kingdom fell away from us, broke away. Originally, we had a unity, but they broke apart. The Northern Kingdom then has exerted influence over us, but that's not the way it was supposed to be. Now, a lot of scholars believe that there was a united monarchy, that David actually did create that. And I have another book that says no, that building on other scholars and say it's very unlikely that there's a united monarchy. And in this book, I show why. Because just to get a little bit of that, it's easier for for the Davidic dynasty to say, "Come on, all you Northerners, come down and join us. We have always been the kingdom, the dynasty that is supposed to reign over all Israel. Now that your northern kingdom has fallen, now that Samaria is no longer, come return to Judah. Come return to Jerusalem and David." Why return? Because we already had a united monarchy at the very beginning. And this is not something new. And it's, of course, definitely something new historically. I'm not, I shouldn't say definitely, but it's most likely that there was not a united monarchy. And the scribes are creating that memory so that the Judean kings, think of Hezekiah, Josiah, powerful kings in this period where Judah now seizes the day and becomes a major player in the region. It starts to say, we all along were the divinely chosen dynasty, and therefore one has to come to Jerusalem and come back to the fold that where David was the shepherd and guarded the flock of all Israel. And so that all Israel concept is then co-opted by Judah and used for a political agenda because the Davidic dynasty is still on the throne. The north has fallen, but the Davidic dynasty in Jerusalem is still on the throne, and they last for about 130 years. But eventually that kingdom goes down. And that's when we really have the making of the Bible.
So when do we start seeing evidence for the formation of the Torah, the Pentateuch?
Evidence for the formation of the Torah and the Pentateuch. That's a difficult one. So we have probably older stories of like Jacob and the stories of Isaac and Esau, stories of Moses and Miriam and so forth. Those can be older stories, in some form, even perhaps written down, perhaps not. But you're asking about where we start to see the formation of the Torah. Now, the Torah is not just a few stories here and there, but a larger unit, of course, and it consists of the Pentateuchal laws, the laws of Moses from Sinai, and then later in the book of Exodus, and they run through Leviticus and some in Numbers, and a lot in Deuteronomy, a second law giving, and we have different theories about how all that developed and how it evolved, and I enter into some of the more salient points and try to show why that matters a little bit. But what's central for me is that we have this archive from Egypt of Judeans, and they're writing during the Persian period, so around like the middle of the fifth century, so around 430, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's the story. That's the book in the Bible that talks about the return. And when this book, this formative, important book, describes how Judeans returned, it tells about how they rebuilt the temple and devoted their lives to the Torah. They returned to the Torah, as in the days of Moses. And so that book has shaped our understanding of this period a lot. And scholars have kind of assumed that this is the birth point, or the time that Judaism really emerges, whatever it's called, the birth. And this is when it all happens. And Ezra and Nehemiah seems to be so historical because it just makes sense that after the exile, it all came together. But returning to this Elephantina colony, this colony of Judeans on the island of Elephantina, or Yev, down on the Nile, guarding Persian imperial interest, right? Where we find this archive, we find them writing to Jerusalem. Get this. This is the important part. They're writing to Jerusalem. And they are asking about things that are explicitly forbidden in the Torah. And they never think that they're going to be called reprobates for doing so. They never think to ask, can you send us a Torah scroll? That can you look in your Torah scrolls and help us? This is a time, not even at the beginning of the return period, right? Cyrus the Great is the one where it supposedly all started to happen, which is 70 years after the Babylonian exile in the ideal construction of this time in the Bible. But right? This is long after Cyrus the Great. This is the time of Artaxerxes II. And in the late 5th century, like around the time of 400, 430 to 400. So we would expect the Torah to be really getting some traction in Jerusalem, especially, but also to at least be known about in a Judean colony where we have all kinds of writings, all their archives. They do we know all about them, more about them than any other community before centuries later, other than the kind of biblical text we have, whose historicity is difficult. But here we have firsthand what we call as historians primary sources. And these primary sources show us that they are, yes, worshiping a God named Yahu, as in the Bible. But this God also has a wife, and there are other deities around them, and it's not the biblical religion as we see in the Torah at all, and they're never castigated for it. That's really odd for me. So it shows us that the Torah might have been taking shape right now, might have been taking shape at that point, let's say around 400, in a very major way. I think it probably had to be. But here's the point. It cannot have been, start over. It cannot have been commonly known. It must have been still the work of scribes. Scribes for themselves, writing for themselves, thinking for themselves, envisioning, as Ezra and Nehemiah does, a community that would take their text seriously and make them the center of their lives. But nevertheless, that the Torah itself and much of the biblical writings, for that matter, are still in the shops of scribes, not at the center, not in the public plaza and the city gates. And that's why we can't really speak of, we don't know to what extent the Torah has taken shape at this time, but it's probably just starting to really take the form as we know it. Does that help?
Oh yeah, I think it definitely does. Can you tell us a bit about monotheism and why we have to put a question mark next to that when it comes to reading at least certain parts of the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why this monotheism question is important is because a lot of people tend to assume that we have a Bible because it's, monotheistic religion is somehow superior and it just makes more sense. And the Bible was from the get-go at some level monotheistic, and that's why we have it still transmitted and read. What that can't explain as well. The only other corpus of text that we really have transmitted like we have the Bible are Greek text. And they have a lot of gods. They don't need monotheism to make the text transmittable and beloved and sacred to people. Maybe the Greek texts are not sacred, but they are definitely, they have a long reception history, just like the Bible. So it's not monotheism. And monotheism, I argue, is really not a proper category at all for the Bible. It's not like the Bible has not yet discovered monotheism. You do see in some texts, like 2nd Isaiah, where they start polemicizing. 2nd Isaiah is written in Babylon during the exile. So these poets and prophets are polemicizing against all of these idols and making fun of them. And they come very close to what we would call monotheistic thought and expressions. But that's an outlier. There's not much of that. There is a little bit elsewhere. The Bible, one doesn't need to think that, well, it's not yet, it's like our religion is always evolving towards monotheism, and the Hebrew Bible hasn't gotten there yet. Remember, the New Testament is, for at least from the perspective of Jews, not necessarily monotheistic, and Muslims and Jews have a lot more in common. They can share holy spaces that they can't share with Christians because of Jesus and the Holy Spirit and what that all means for monotheism. But in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, Um, Other gods are also, though, uh, assumed to exist. Even a late book like Ruth talks about the period of the judges, but everybody agrees it's written very late, one of the latest books. And you know that part of the story where Ruth is returning with Naomi from the Moabite land where she has become a widow, like Naomi has. And they're returning to Bethlehem, the house of bread, and because the famine is over. And she tells Ruth, turn back. And Ruth says, no. And then she makes that long address that is used often in weddings, even though it's between two women. It's really wonderful. She says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you die, I will die. But the fundamental line here for ours, your God will be my God and your people will be my people. So, meaning that even this late book says, I'm leaving the land of my ancestors and I'm going to and then your God will be my God. Because if I was staying back in my land, it would be the land of the God of that land. So, the book of Ruth, like much of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, and ancient Near Eastern text, imagines that there are gods, or primary gods at least, over different territories, and that they kind of that when you enter the land of the Moabites, the god Mesha is the god there, even though there are other kinds of gods that may serve in Mesha's pantheon. They're much smaller than in Greece, but some kind of royal family kind of mirroring the palace. And that's the way also probably we would have with Yahweh, and we can see remnants of that in the Elephantine papyri that I just mentioned from um, Egypt, where God has a wife. But here's the fundamental point: all these lands have their own gods, and when one enters from one land to another, the gods changes, and that's why we have in the Hebrew Bible like these texts, like "How can I worship you in a foreign land?" That even in a foreign land, you're not the God of all the universe. Other texts try to make that push. You're the God of all the universe, therefore we can worship you anywhere. We don't have to be back in our homeland. We can be an exiled people and still worship the God of our homeland, of our forefathers and foremothers. But that took innovation, and we can see that innovation um, taking place. Sorry, my dog is bothered by the postman, but
I
we can
don't
see
hear
that.
I don't hear your dog, and that's what you're concerned with.
Okay, so we can see that innovation on display in the text we study and how we date them. And so monotheism is really. Let me say one more point about the monotheism. The Bible doesn't want to have it. Doesn't want to have monotheism. It wants to have a special relationship between Israel and Israel's God, and other peoples have special relationships with their gods. And the story of Israel is the story of this special relationship where God chooses Abram and Sarah, and in their old age, and they have this son and another son, and the families that emerge from them, the struggles, all of that. That's um, that story that develops into a national epic, but it's told alongside other stories, and it's understood that there's a world inhabited by different peoples with different gods. And so um, when when Yahweh brings Israel out of Egypt, Yahweh has to establish, go to war with the gods of Egypt and establish that Yahweh is stronger than them in some way. They couldn't do that if there were no other gods. And some of the texts do that by saying, okay, there were no other gods. Really, Yahweh was up against the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was the king who represented the Egyptians, and Yahweh is the divine king without a palace representing Israel, and that's who really does this, does all the work on behalf of Israel. But the point there is that they want to have this. The biblical texts want to have this conflict and competition and rivalry to make the point of the specialness of Yahweh vis-a-vis other gods, and the specialness of Yahweh vis-a-vis Israel, Yahweh's people. Does that help?
Yes. And so when you look at stories like the war between Judah and Moab, and and they seem to lose. Their God seems to lose to them, and the Moabite stone seems to sort of
Yeah.
the account in Kings that talks about this, and
Hmm.
and it judges God and his and the Judean soldiers seem to be defeated by iron chariots. What do you think about that?
Okay. So let me just, I don't know about the iron chariots um, part, but let's start with the Mesha part. So Second Kings 3 talks about this coalition of Israel and Judah. And once again, you can see how Israel, the king of Israel, is stronger than the king of Judah there, as I was making the point about the two kingdoms. The northern king of Israel comes down and says, "You're going to go to war with me." And they'll say, "Okay, let's go." He didn't really have much of a choice. And that's the King Jehoshaphat, one of the funniest names, perhaps, in the Hebrew Bible, Josephat. But, anyways, while they're there, while they go on the campaign, they go out in this territory, and very interesting stuff happens. It seems like a weird old text. 2 points. When they call the prophet Elisha, like one of the Yahweh's righteous prophets throughout the book of Kings, they tell him, prophesy for us, tell us what's going to happen in this battle before we go into war. We go into battle. And he says, I really don't want to serve you. You're an evil king of the north. But because the southern king's here, Jehoshaphat, I'll go ahead and do it. But here's what he does. He says, bring me a singer, a musician. So we always imagine prophets just like saying, thus hear the word of the Lord, as if they're Protestant ministers. But here in this one vignette of of ancient biblical prophecy, we see that Elisha starts prophesying when he starts probably whirling around in this music and getting dizzy until he gets into this mantic mode where he starts speaking in the name of the deity. Now that's weird already, but it's what's even weirder in that text is that when they're going up against King Mesha, whom we know from this Moabite stone that you mentioned, the Mesha Stela, which is one of the, if not the, I argue it is the most important extra biblical archaeological find for our understanding of the Bible, the Mesha Stela. But that same king is under his name. Mesha is in 2 Kings 3 in this text, and they're going up against his city, and they are prevailing. And as they're prevailing against it and almost being able to conquer it, the king Mesha sacrifices his firstborn son, his heir to the throne. He sacrifices him on the wall. And the anger of Yahweh turns against the people, and they have to pull back. And they end up losing the battle because of the efficacy of this child sacrifice. Of that the heir to the throne, one's own future, that one was willing to give it all, one's future for the deity. The deity is somehow moved by this, and then and turns and can be swayed by that kind of thing. It's quite weird stuff, and scholars still debate why this is still included in the Bible, whether it's like really late, but it seems to be an outlier, and it quite likely could be also representing how things actually worked in the period before the consciousness of the Torah starts to make itself felt throughout these texts.
So, what led to the eventual fall of the kingdom of Judah?
Good question. What led to the fall of Judah? Politically, I spend the first part of the book going through and kind of easy to follow chapters about how the history works and all the most important archaeological finds and And what we know from other kinds of sources, like from the uh, archives that we've discovered through modern archaeology from Assyria and Babylon and stuff. So I go through all of that and I lay out why historically Judah fell and Israel fell, why they were conquered. And the reasons are complex. There are poor political decisions on the parts of their kings. There were things beyond their control, however. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah are located on the land bridge, what we call the land bridge, connecting east and, let's say, the Mesopotamian region, the Euphrates and Tigris, the Fertile Crescent. It connects that where Iraq and Iran is with Egypt. You can't cross through the Arabian desert. It's very treacherous. It's a very long trek, and so they'd go up where kind of where water sources were, and they would go down through ancient Palestine down to the southern Levant, and where they headed? Not to Jerusalem. They were headed to Egypt, because that was the other great civilizational center. There was the gold. And Israel and Judah got in the way. That's pretty much the fair way to put it. They got in the way of this imperial advent onslaught, this march toward of one imperial center, civilizational center, toward the other. And everything in between, either you bend your neck to the yoke and become a vassal, or you resist and get destroyed. And often the Israelite and Judahite kings were great vassals. They paid their tribute, and often they didn't. So that's all the whole political side, and we could go into the details there, but that's not as helpful for us as to understand that the Bible does something very different with that. The Bible is not saying we just made some poor political, militaristic kinds of decisions, or not militaristic, but strategic decisions in our bout with Babylon. And if we had just taken another military strategy or done something else diplomatically better, we would have all been here today. No, the biblical authors are trying to say this is the culmination of a long pattern of sin on the part of the nation. And we are the reason. We left the covenant that stipulated our future, how we would live long in this land. We left that covenant. And as we left it, we merited what the covenant stipulated, and that is the curses. The curse is that if you're faithful to me and you're faithful to each other and you care for the orphan and the widow and the stranger, you will live long in the land. But if you don't do all of that and many other things, some of them very problematic things from our perspective today, but if you don't do all these things and care for each other and live in fidelity with your God and your neighbors and what, then you will be conquered and exiled and so forth. And that's really where the biblical project really leans in and starts to do some really creative work, because it gives a defeated community hope that right, a small little kingdom on the margins of society, not the big imperial centers like so many small states in our world today, not the US, not China. Those were the two centers, US and China today, Egypt and Mesopotamia back then. All these little countries, two of them are Israel and Judah, and they couldn't have hope. It would be a tragic vision of that would have really shaped their political consciousness, meaning that we either have to somehow collaborate with the empire to save our skins, but there really is nothing beyond the will of the empire that dictates history. History is just mainly a story of power. Well, the biblical authors are saying, no, it's not. It's not a story of just whoever's the biggest wins. It's a story that even as we are a small people, the smallest of all peoples, we can control our destiny and we have hope. There is a larger purpose and rationale to history. It is a relationship with our God. And all of that was just really inspirational for other scribes and other communities to rethink every facet of their existence. And so, to answer your question, like what led to Judah's downfall? Historically, a lot of inevitable things coupled with political um, stupidity, perhaps, but in the biblical imagination, so much more. And it's that narrative and that larger uh, um, construction, theological, historical, political construction that is so powerful for the making of the Bible.
What is important about the soldier Hoshayahu?
Um, yeah, nice question. Hoshayahu is the name of every chapter has a name of a biblical figure, but Hoshayahu, the biblical figure, tells kind of their story, represents kind of the theme of the chapter. But one of them is not a biblical figure. His name is Hoshayahu, and he's a soldier, and we have his letters or a letter from him, and it's written. It's what's called an ostraca, which is a broken potsherd or shard, and people would use them to write on, or scribes would use them to write on with ink, because they were a smooth surface, and they could use them in a cheap way. This is before you had paper, and leather was very expensive and papyrus very expensive. So the cheapest material was the pottery, the pot that broke last night. We'll use it to write a letter. Anyways, we have one of these letters, and the reason why we have these ostracas, of course, because they don't shrivel up and fade away like leather and papyrus would. So we have these ceramic shards, and one of them is a letter sent in the final decades of Babylon, of Judah's existence before Babylon conquers it. And it's very interesting. And what we have in that letter is this protestation, as another scholar calls it, of a soldier that he could read. Um, he's, he seems to have been accused that he didn't read the letter himself. And so we have him saying, no, I can read this, and I remember everything. I don't need to have a scribe read it to me. He's a sar, which is like an officer, but he's not illiterate, and good officers shouldn't be illiterate. So what we have here is looking at how writing and reading served the functions of the state, a state that was on the brink of disaster. But nevertheless, that's the text we have from ancient Judah and Israel. And the scribes had to reinvent the conception of and purpose of writing to get to the Bible, to get from those kinds of letters about how writing and reading works among elites, among people serving the palace and the military, on the one hand, to texts that are not just for elites, but for a whole community. And that's the bridge that I want to explain between the stuff that we have from these final decades, letters from generals saying, or officers saying that they can read and assuming that they're not like everybody else who can't read, to a model of education like we have in Ezra and Nehemiah, where the idea is that everyone will have text at the center of their lives and will be focused on learning.
So now I'd like to shift to Ezra. What do we see happening in the time of Ezra and the formation of the Torah?
So, like, Ezra is ostensibly this guy who is the scribe who brings the Torah to the community. And when does he do that? He does it after the exile, after the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem, and the city is now being repopulated. and being rebuilt. And Ezra comes during those events, during those years. The book tells about the building of the temple, but also the building of the wall around Jerusalem and a lot of other kinds of construction projects. And then Ezra comes, and in the middle of all that uh, rebuilding activity, brings the Torah to the whole community, and they all embrace it and place it at the center of their lives. And as I just noted with Hosheyahu, this is a long way in terms of the imagined use and advantage of writing from what we see in a letter from a soldier on the front lines. And what Ezra is really doing, and I think historically we don't know much about him. He might have been a priest. He could have been a scribe. I try to make the case that it's unlikely that he was known for his scribal or textual activities. But the text, the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, that's the biblical story, makes him into this grand scribe who has a vision of how a text could be at the center of their community. We're told he devoted his heart to study the Torah, the traditions, the teachings, and to teach all Israel. Teach, right? To study and to teach. And what Ezra represents for me is not so much what happens at his time, which may be in many ways a mythical kind of construction by the authors of Ezra and Nehemiah. But what's important for me is that these authors, these scribes, are imagining themselves and imagining their own roles in ways that really went beyond convention. And that is that they became like the intellectuals that I see in other times and places, whether it's in Europe or in Asia or in African countries where people may have day jobs, but they spend their evenings and free time writing and thinking and creating things that don't have a direct payoff for some kind of from employer or palace or propaganda. They really are thinking very deeply about what it means to be who we are, and what is our purpose, and what is uh, our larger ethos that holds us together, and these different kinds of questions. And these are political, deep, philosophical, artistic, poetic writings that we see from throughout history. And that's how I imagine these scribes who are creating the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then imagining their kind of ideal figure, the one with whom they could identify as this Ezra who studies the Torah all his days and devotes himself to teaching all of Israel. And then in this grand moment, which I describe as a rock concert, all the people are gathered in Jerusalem. They say, "Give us the Torah, give us the Torah." And then Ezra enters the stage. You can read it in Nehemiah 8. It looks just like a rock concert. Ezra mounts the stage with the Torah, and when he raises the Torah, all the people scream, cry, and they fall down on and weep. And then he reads it. The music is this text he reads. And then after it's read, it's explained to them. So it's not just something that they hear, but rather have to think about. And then they go and celebrate. And they, over the course of the next days, they devote themselves to this text and start learning with Ezra and so forth. All of that is aspirational. All of that is an attempt to say, by these scribes, to say, this is the way society maybe if we work hard enough to make it that way. And that's what they work toward. And you know what? They were successful. As a Jew, I go to the synagogue, and that same kind of ritual of lifting the Torah, reading it, and all of the kinds of festivities around it, eating and drinking afterwards, are very much an unbroken tradition going back to this imagined time of Ezra and Nehemiah.
Why is it that the book of Ezra is referred to as the book of Ezra and Nehemiah?
Um, Phew. I'm an expert on Ezra and Nehemiah, and I should know that answer that question. If I understand it correctly, sorry, postman again. We got
No problem.
a lot of stuff being delivered these days, and he's okay. Hank, it's good. Okay, so why is the book of Ezra called Ezra and Nehemiah? Well, it's often asked in terms of why is the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, why are they linked together? Why do you like? Is it really one book or is it two books? And why do we always put them together? And there are scholars who believe that they were separate books, but we had a discussion on this, and there was a whole book published around this. Are Ezra and Nehemiah two books or one? And there are different views that were presented in different chapters, and it's a big book. But I think the correct answer, and I'm pretty much willing to stake a lot on it, is that Ezra and Nehemiah is one book, and that the at the end of Ezra 9, or sorry 10, at the very end, it's often translated falsely as they did something to divorce their wives, and if you look at the NRSV, it says and they did something like divorce, but that's not in the Hebrew text. That's in the Greek text, which clearly is trying to figure out, like, how does this book end? But it just breaks off there. And then it continues in Nehemiah. These are the words of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 1. And in the Hebrew scrolls, they're always written together. And it's everybody agrees on that. But the question is whether the Hebrew scrolls are trying to join them. No, it must have been always together, because the Ezra story then picks up again in the third person after 6 or 7 chapters of Nehemiah, and then Ezra is there again. So, however, to explain the composition, and that's something that's very complex of how this all came together, um, the, the texts as we have them form one book, and therefore it's not right to call these things Ezra and Nehemiah as separate books, but rather Ezra and Nehemiah, or Ezra and Nehemiah, as a single kind of unified composition. And for me, that's wonderful because they represent two different figures, two different models, and to have this dyad, Ezra Nehemiah, is very much in keeping with later Jewish tradition to have these dyads, these two figures coming together, because let's face it, having two leaders is better than one usually, I think.
Hmm. Now, what does Nehemiah do after Ezra's time? What's important about him?
Nehemiah, or Nehemiah, is this guy who is his cupbearer. Cupbearer, right? It's a honorary position that he has. And where is he? In the Persian court in Susa. He serves Artaxerxes II, and he describes his encounters with this king one day. He describes himself as very beloved by the king, and he asks for a vacation, a leave of absence, so that he could go back to Jerusalem. He probably had never been there, and he's going to go and help rebuild the city. And that's what the story, his own account, it's his first person account. And that's what he describes of how he got there, how he motivated the community to embrace this project, the trouble that they ran into along the way, and then also how within the context of this work, they started to take on new projects in the sense of reforms, radical reforms of the way they did business, the way they kept the Sabbath, the way they did marriage, the way on and on. And so Nehemiah is very important for me, is because he's the first um, biblical author, and maybe the only biblical author whom we know by name. He identifies himself as, I am Nehemiah ben Chachaliah, that's his father's name. I was a cupbearer, and so forth. And nowhere else do we have a first person writing, and nowhere else can we be confident that the guy who is identifying himself as the writer. We have no herself, but himself as the writer is the actual writer, right? David can say, we can have some psalm with a superscription that says these are David's words, but no one agrees that, no one really believes that those superscriptions are anywhere trustworthy. And then you can point to other places in the Bible, but this is the one point where all scholars agree, with very few exceptions, that we have the actual writing. It could be by a scribe, but for all intents and purposes, it's right from the hand of a person whom we know. And so this is the only case where we have a biblical author and we know the name of the author and we know the text that he wrote. All the other biblical texts are anonymous. And that anonymity goes a long way to explaining why we have biblical texts today. The scribes have taken themselves out of the picture and have focused their attention on others, the Abraham and the Sarahs and the Isaac and the Rebeccas, and they construct these figures so that their readers can identify with them. And that's what makes that literature so powerful. It's not about Nehemiah talking about how great he is. No one really enjoys reading that. I wrote my dissertation on it. And it's like, I was the first one to have written on it for like decades. And now people are writing on it more, but it was like, no one really wants to read about some guy claiming that he's the greatest. And so the one case in which we have a scribe identify himself, or at least a writer or something, like in the case of Nehemiah, it's the one case where the text is probably the least read of all text. I do put a caveat on that because in certain Christian circles, evangelical circles, Nehemiah or Nehemiah is read with a lot of interest for building projects in Christian churches, building funds, and a lot of religious communities have these building fund project campaigns. And what better text to use for your Sunday sermons for like 6 weeks than Nehemiah?
What are your thoughts on Jonah and the whale? Where does that story come from?
Jonah and the whale. I have a chapter called Jonah and the whale. And and what I do in that chapter is the question of prophecy. And what interests me there is the story of how Jonah and the whale, or the Jonah and Nineveh, represents this kind of common perception of what prophecy is. Jonah is supposed to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and tell the inhabitants to repent, or otherwise they're going to be destroyed. And so one uses the book of Jonah, that model, repent or you're going to be destroyed, as a way of understanding how all prophecy was supposed to work. That the whole point of the prophets was that you would preach to this population, whether it's Israel or Judah or what have you, the palace, and that you would then get the audience to repent and come back, and then disaster will be averted. But I try to show that's not the proper way to understand the prophetic writings. And then the book of Jonah in particular, where it comes from, I don't know. I know there are a lot of great books out there that are currently being written, one by Julie Claessens. And there's great stuff that will look at how the name Jonah Ben Amittai appears in the book of Kings, and maybe someone latched onto his name and then started writing a story about him. And but fundamentally, it's an attempt. It's a good story, and it doesn't have a whole lot of historical, traction or any kind of basis other than perhaps that name, and an attempt to link, to find a prophet, right? So if you're thinking about how they wrote the book of Jonah, they knew that this prophet from the book of Kings lived at this one time, and they needed to write a story about Assyria, Nineveh, before it was destroyed, the empire was destroyed by the Babylonians, so that they could say that our prophet during his days went to Nineveh. This is the story of Jonah, and preached to it. And if here's the really fun part of the story. They say, now if Nineveh, the Syrians, had not repented, as Jonah requested, as God commanded, as our God of Israel commanded, they would have been destroyed. And if they had been destroyed, then they wouldn't have destroyed us. But they repented, and thus they lived to see another day. And eventually they conquered us. And you know why they conquered us? Because we didn't repent. It's really wonderful irony and beautiful storytelling. But it's the problem with that book is that one often then, as I just said, uses it as kind of the lens through which one reads all the prophets. And for me, it's important to tell that story, just to tell you, to introduce to the readers, that's not the way normal prophecy in the Bible works. And namely, the prophets are not about trying to get people to repent. They're trying to come to terms with the fact of defeat itself. And they're trying to go back and say, this could have been averted. But just as promised, the word of our God played itself out in history. And our own defeat, our own trauma is testimony to the power of our God's words. So it's really after the fact, survival literature trying to deal with a reality and come to terms with it in a very profound theological way. But it's not about just the simple message of, if you repent, all will go well. That's based on Jonah in some ways, and it's not helpful.
I'd like to go back for a little bit to the book of Judges. When do you think it was composed?
Whew. The book of Judges is often understood to be like one of the earlier compositions, and then later scholars said, well, it was, part of the Deuteronomistic history, which was supposed to be had been written around either the time of Josiah or after the exile. So Josiah would have lived before the exile, and he was a powerful king. And the idea of this Deuteronomistic history is that his court created the larger work from Deuteronomy all the way to Kings. My model uses Judges in some sense, as Europeans have already done this, in pushback against this older model. And that is, Judges is a work that connects the history of the conquest, the Exodus and the conquest, right? In the book of Joshua ends with everything conquered and the land inhabited by Israel, and choose this day whom you shall serve. And for me, my house will serve the Lord, and on goes it. And it's this nice climatic moment. And there's another history. It's the book of Samuel, and it continues into the Kings. And in that history, remember, it begins with Hannah, the birth of Samuel. And the Philistines kind of control the show. And Israel is not in power. And for the reader, if you were to jump just from Joshua to Samuel, you would like, what happened? They were doing so well at the end of Joshua, but now they are struggling. And so the book of Joshua or Judges tells about how a downward spiral, how they lost that sovereignty, how they lost that territorial power. And so the book is quite late, I think. Now, I make a case against that bridge although I agree with it essentially, that's the way it functions at some point. I actually think that the older stories were just continuations of the Exodus and conquest story, the story of like Deborah. Deborah is an old story within the book of Judges, perhaps, as people have long claimed, or perhaps it's really a late addition to the Exodus conquest story, the book of Joshua, kind of telling how another generation managed to do very well without a king, like they did in the days of Joshua. And in this case, it was a woman who was the highest authority. And so when was her story written? I'm not saying that I know in any way, but it would be probably quite late. But the song that then what's called the Song of Deborah, that could be older than the narrative, as many acclaim, but I think it's also quite late. And as I mentioned, it's an attempt to kind of imagine a larger northern identity after the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. Um, and it's the reason why it's so significant is it talks about all of Israel, but it only has 10 tribes. It doesn't have Judah in it or Simeon, and that's the southern tribe. So it's trying to say, who are we, Israel? We're all up here in the north, but this kingdom down here in the south that's claiming that they are the real rulers over all Israel, they're not even a part of us at all, and they imagine a new an identity that excludes Judah. And so you have some old stuff there that has to be older than the destruction of Judah. So it has to be before 586 and maybe go all the way back to 722 or somewhere in there, or even there's an older version that is even of the song that as I try to reconstruct it is really has nothing to do with Deborah at all, and that it could be that older song to Yahweh's power could be some kind of hymn that you would have in the book of Psalms. So you have a mixed bag. You have all kinds of things in it, and it's difficult to say. But the book itself is a late construct to bridge two histories: the history of the Exodus and the conquest with the pinnacle of Joshua and everything going well, and then another history in Samuel Kings where everything's not going well, and they have to explain how you get there.
By which time does the Torah reach its final form?
Yeah, thank you. That's a final question that's really difficult for us. Um, as I noted, we have the Elephantina stuff from Egypt, in which the community does not seem to be um, aware of its existence, and then we have this thing with that we have today. We do also have something, you know, earlier manuscripts that go back into the Middle Ages, and then before that, we have the translation of the Torah from Hebrew into Greek. So we know by at least by the time of the Greek translation, it must have been in final form, because the Greek translation, even though it has differences from the Hebrew, which show an earlier form of our Hebrew text, it's pretty much the same. And then you go back before that, and it's the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll text. And they have a lot of the same kinds of things that we have in terms of how it's not one big Torah scroll. They didn't have a scroll big enough to do that. They couldn't do that. But they had books of Genesis and Exodus and so forth that are very similar to what we have. And so those, let's say the earliest ones are maybe second century, perhaps late third century. So we have to say that at some time at least by the second century BCE or BC, that the Torah seems to be in the final form. And a lot of people say that might have to do something with the Hasmoneans, that they are now reestablishing a kingdom, and that might have spurred the kind of uh, making of the text as we have it. What's interesting, though, is if it's the Hasmoneans who are doing this, what I can't explain is why they don't have a king, a royal king, a royal figure prominently within their text. It's hard for me to imagine that some kind of big state and dynasty would want to publish a text that has no place for them in it, and that pushes King David and all kings way back and says kings are not important for us. What we need really for our existence is our covenant, our Torah. So it could still be around the time of the Hasmoneans. It just shouldn't be understood as coming right from the propaganda machine of the Hasmoneans. I hope that's helpful. You have asked so many wonderful questions. I'm very impressed by this conversation with you.
Well,
All this stuff that you've had. Tell me a little bit about yourself quickly before we end. I think the audience wants to hear a little bit more too. At least my students will want to know. Tell us about who you are.
sure. Well, in a quick summary, I started my research back in 2014 when I became curious about the origins of the Bible. My father's side is ethnically Jewish, and my mother's side is Catholic. And
Interesting.
I was pretty much always an atheist, but maybe in a
Uh-huh.
brief spot in which I wasn't so sure, but then I became more affirmed as an atheist again. And I wanted to understand why people believe in the religions that they believe in.
Yeah.
I wanted to figure out the origins. I've always been fascinated with ancient history, and obviously ancient history and religion cross over quite a bit. And
Yeah.
I wanted to understand where religion came from. And I wanted to interview professionals like yourself so I could learn, upload it on YouTube, and so that my audience can learn with me.
That's so awesome. That's so awesome. I'm sure that people are very grateful for what you're doing, and I know that I'm very grateful for you taking the time to like work through the book and ask such penetrating, difficult questions. I've never been asked such difficult questions in an interview, and I enjoyed it. And I hope that we could do this again.
Absolutely, same here. Thanks again, Professor Wright.
My pleasure. Bye, buddy.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.